Welcome back, I'm Kimberly and this is Floral Art Review. This week in our design analysis, where we use our AI DesignEye to give me some feedback on a design, we're looking at Rust and Roses. Now this was a collage design. The easel on which it is displayed was supplied by the organisers. So we had a space limit of 80 centimetres in height and 60 centimetres in width. The framework that I have used, the black section behind the design itself, is just a simple canvas stretched artboard painted black to give me the sizing that I needed, because the actual framework for the design that I wanted to use is a black metal frame that's designed as a bit of a garden ornament. So it's actually turned on its side. Normally it is placed horizontally, so landscape. And it has little metal circles that are sections for candles to be placed on. And then it has the black metal segment areas. And I like it because it always reminds me of Mondrian paintings, and I do enjoy those. So I use it fairly regularly in designs, but I always make it look a little bit different. So on this occasion, I have the outside black frame. I have in places painted with paint that is designed to look like it's actually rust, so it's not fully covered across the metal, but looks like those areas have rusted through. And then in the section, so that the back part of it that would normally be resting on the black frame, I didn't want black in the back of it. I wanted it to be a featured section. So I've placed some handmade paper that has plant material embedded in it, so you can see a little bit of that through the design. That's the cream coloured background. And then randomly in the sections, the metal sections, I've put some coconut fibre, some paper bark, some melaleuca, and some green sisal, which again is a plant-based fabric material. And then there are some small slices of timber. Now, I'm hesitating about describing them because I actually bought them when I was in Ireland, and so I don't know what sort of wood they're made from. It's obviously a local wood from there, but they're much smaller than the slices that I would use here, which normally come from Banksia, but I know they're not Banksia because they came from Ireland. So there's also some vials that are covered in the coconut fibre and the paper, plant embedded paper. I'm trying to think how to explain it. And in those vials I've got some yellow roses. Now roses were the only flower that we were allowed to use on this day of competition. Once again, it's from a competition that runs for about 2 weeks. I've mentioned it previously. It's one of the big competitions I have each year, so I'll put upwards of 35 designs across those 2 weeks. So this was one of, I think, 4 or 5 on this particular day. And roses, because it's on the specimen side of things, it's the Rose Championship Day, so we can only use roses in our floral art designs. So I've used some yellow roses. Now I know at the time that I was looking for roses that were more of an orangey, sunsetty, rust coloured rose, and I couldn't get them. And so the closest I could get was the yellow, and I know I wasn't happy with the yellow, and I thought that I wouldn't do particularly well because they were not the right colour in my eyes for this particular design. The only other thing there, in terms of a collage, generally you would look at items being grouped together that tell the story of the design. So in the centre of the design I've put a set of Allen keys that I found at the farm that were rusted very conveniently, and so I've got them hanging there as sort of the central, the draw point for this design. My overall feeling when I look at it now is that it's lacking something. I don't know whether it's the placements or whether the yellow colour still jars a little bit with me. Happy with the textures, as you would expect. The texture is something that I do focus on. I'm happy with the idea of the rust around the implied rust around the edge of the design. Maybe there's just too many blank spaces, and I think the green of the sisal is worrying me in that it's not really reflected anywhere else, because I didn't, and we couldn't use foliage. I should have had green somewhere else in the design. So that's my take on this design as I look at it before I see what the AI analysis is. The design placed second in the competition, so obviously there's still room for improvement in the judges' eyes. So let's now see what AI's got to tell me about what I could do to improve the design. Title interpretation, first of all. The title Rust and Roses immediately suggests a dialogue between decay and beauty, structure and softness, or industrial and organic elements. It's interesting that that's the automatic reaction from an independent analysis. I think in terms of floral art, we would always, when we see a title, I know I do, we start to think about what have I got that I could use, what does that actually mean to me? Or at the other end of the scale, we get a title and we think, I have no idea what to do with that design. So even in helping you think about how you could interpret a design, it's always good to be able to refer back to an independent thought process. The use of yellow roses against an earthy and textured background successfully juxtaposes life and bloom, the roses, with erosion and age, the rust. The incorporation of found objects such as metal, bark and rough fibre reinforces the rust aspect conceptually and visually. So overall, in terms of the interpretation of the title, the analysis is that it's done that well. Let's look now individually at the principles and elements of design and see what we can find out from that. So line, first of all, strong geometric linear grid work dominates the design. That's the structure itself, adding structure and leading the viewer's eye. Lines intersect in vertical and horizontal directions, creating compartments and controlled movement, which is good. You know, it's a static display, but there's still the idea of movement. There's lots of negative space in it as well. The natural curve of rose stems and fibrous wrapping creates soft contrast to the rigid line work. And that is something that is important, because if you've got a very rigid background, a very rigid structure, you need something that softens that so that you get the contrast, first of all, but that you get the implied movement, because with very straight lines, you're not going to get very much organic movement in a design. Form. This piece is predominantly flat, two-dimensional, as expected in a collage, with 3D relief elements provided by the rose heads and the wrap textures. The form and depth introduced by roses gives the work tactile and visual richness. So the form itself, you know, we often look at form as being the repetition of the shape of the plant material that we put into a design. So if we even looked at that, we've got because of the way that the structure works, we've got repeated rectangular form in the background, and then we've got repeated round or circular form in little slices of the timber, in the roses and in the vials. So that's an interesting revisit for me of how I've looked at the form in that design. Texture. Excellent use of contrasting textures, rough wood bark, coarse fibre coir wrapping, smooth petals of the roses, rusted aged metal, handmade mulberry style paper for the background. The contrast enhances visual and tactile interest, delivering a rich layered aesthetic. And as you will know from any of my previous videos, texture is the thing that works the best with me in terms of the principles and elements of design. It's the one thing that I feel very comfortable with in terms of creating contrasts and creating interest in designs. So it's always a good reinforcement for me to see that I've done it well in a design, because almost after 20 years, I almost get to the point where I don't think about it, because I expect that it will come naturally to me. And so it's important for me to revisit these areas of feedback and just make sure that I am still on track with that sort of thinking. Space. Negative space is used well between the roses and within the grid lines, avoiding overcrowding. The spatial rhythm is engaging, though some lower areas may benefit from slightly more activity or contrast. And now that I look at it, maybe that's the thing that's worrying me about the design, is that there's a lot of interest in the top 2/3 of the design, but that bottom section below where the Allen key tool set is just a bit sparse. It's just a bit ordinary. Not enough difference in that area for me to feel like it's engaged as part of the design. Colour. Dominant colours are earthy rust browns and ochres, neutral whites and greens, accents of bright yellow roses. The yellow adds vitality and immediate focus, a clever choice to contrast both visually and emotionally with the rustic base. Can you tell I haven't read this before? All of my words at the beginning about how I was disappointed that I had the yellow roses, and now I find that it's a clever choice. It wasn't. I have to admit, it wasn't a clever choice. It was what was available, closest to the colours that I wanted. But as I look at it now with that little pat on the head in mind, perhaps the orange, the roses that I was looking for would not have been the right colour. It would not have given it the colour contrast that I needed, and might have looked actually quite out of place in terms of the other elements, the other colours that I've used in this particular design. Good learning point. Balance. The design achieves asymmetrical balance. Roses are distributed diagonally and feel weighty but not overbearing. The right side appears slightly more visually dominant. A minor adjustment on the left could help the balance. So once again, as we looked about in terms of using the space, that bottom area or one side of it seems to be a bit left out, not enough of a movement. And I think perhaps if I look at the very bottom rows, if I had brought that right to the corner, it would change that dynamic considerably in terms of the placement, the other placements that are there. And that's probably the one thing, often, as I've said before, it is just little things. It's minor adjustments that make big differences to a design. Rhythm. Repetition of rose placement and compartment structures creates a strong visual rhythm. Eye movement is facilitated by the line work and intermittent placement of key focal accents. So our eyes are drawn to the dark lines, the black lines, and there's enough movement within them where they're heading and where they intersect to keep us moving through the design. And then we have the other forms that draw us away from that structured line into a rounded and a more spiralling look at the design. Dominance. The roses are dominating in both colour and relief. This is appropriate given the design brief. The central tool element adds a conceptual focal point and ties the piece to its title. And that's, as I said at the beginning, that's what I wanted. I wanted the rust part because, to my mind, it's the first word, and so it holds a little bit more significance than the rest of the title. But the idea of the roses being dominant in colour and relief is an interesting one as well, because it's, when we look at dominance, the dominance is often the focal point of a design, which can be the very heavy mass of plant material, or it can be line. And in this instance, it's not the line. Even though the line is black and there's lots of it, it's not the line that is the dominant part of the design. It is the colour and the pop that the roses give to the design. Contrast. Achieved through colour, yellow versus rust or neutral, and texture, rough and soft, and form, round and sharp angular divisions, all of which we've talked about. These contrasts enhance interpretation and create tension in a visually satisfying way. So it's not a clashing tension. When we talk about tension in a design, we don't mean that it is a jarring tension. We mean that there's an interplay of importance. And so we know that these things are connected together in some way. So It's tension in terms of strength rather than the jarring qualities that we might often think about when we hear the word tension. Unity. There is clear cohesion of materials and intent. All elements support the story of age and elegance. The composition feels deliberate and well composed. Well, that's good because it was pretty deliberate, and I'm glad that it looks well composed. Just that one movement of that bottom rose, I think, would enhance the composition a little bit more, and still keep it within that unified framework. The strengths of the design now. Thoughtful and meaningful title interpretation, successful integration of floral material with found and constructed objects, so that's the using the key set in the middle, but incorporating that into the rest of the design by having the metal as part of the framework and by having the rust repeated through the external area of that framework. Excellent textual variety and visually compelling contrast. Maintains collage integrity while offering depth and dimension. So some good strengths in that. Let's see now what the suggestions are for improving the design. Number one, rose integration depth. Some roses, especially mid-lower left, appear slightly disconnected from the structure, tucking them more into the grid or enhancing their visual nesting with foliage or texture could improve integration. Now, I can't remember. I'm pretty sure that with this class, where we can only use roses because it is an annual one, we are allowed to use a minimum of foliage, and I probably veered away from using any at all just to be on the safe side. But I think that nesting a couple of those roses with a little bit of foliage around them would help the green sisal placements, but also, as it says, integrate the depth a little bit more in terms of the design. Number two, colour balance. While the yellow roses stand out beautifully, the green panels are not echoed elsewhere in the piece, making them feel slightly isolated. Consider a small echo of green in another texture or filler to unify. So as I just said, perhaps integrating a little bit of foliage would have helped that. The other thing that I could probably do would be to have had perhaps one of the vials wrapped in the green sisal would have integrated it in a different way, because it wouldn't be just the flat panel, it would be that rounded shape which we talked about earlier. So another thing to consider as well. Number three, central emphasis. The centered tool structure, a vintage object perhaps, which, well, it's not really vintage, I don't suppose, in that if it wasn't quite so rusted, we'd still be using it, could be better emphasised as a symbolic element. Perhaps a touch of rust on the frame or extending rose wrapping towards it could strengthen the narrative core. It did have some rust on it, probably not as obvious from this image as it was in real life. But I think that the rose that is closest to it is facing away from it. So perhaps just, once again, little touches, turning it around so the rose was actually heading that way towards the tool would bring it back into that central part of the design. Here I am indicating onto the screen where you can't see what I'm pointing at. That would bring it into, and keep your eye moving in that circular framework, and make that a more stronger central focal point in the design. Number four, bottom visual weight. Adding slight textural or colour contrast at the bottom right corner might help ground the design and guide the eye upward more intentionally. And so this is what I talked about with that bottom corner being a little bit blank past the rose, and perhaps we need something a little bit more there, or a better contrast. Perhaps that would have been a good place to have the vial covered in the green sisal, as well as somewhere else. I think we need it in a couple of places. So once again, another good suggestion. All of the suggestions that it comes up with are ones that I think about when I read them. I think about them and think about my design style, and think about the actual competition, and think about how I could incorporate those changes but they're always useful. It's always a benefit to me to go back and get this kind of feedback about a design, because the opportunity for us to get feedback at competitions is very limited. Very, very few competitions these days will give you written feedback, and certainly not in the same sort of depth as you would get through the analysis this way. So the overall impression of the design, Rust and Roses is a well executed and conceptually rich floral collage design. It bridges the contrast between nature and decay, old and new, soft and hard, with control and artistic flair. A few small refinements would help enhance clarity and cohesion, but the foundation is already strong and memorable. So a really good, concise bit of feedback about the overall impression of design. And we now know from the individual analysis of those principles and elements what I could try to strengthen the design even further. I, as you can hear, benefit every time that one of these analyses is done. So if you would like to get that benefit as well, just visit the website, upload your image, follow the instructions there, and within about 24 hours, you'll have your own report back in exactly the same format as you see here that I present to you every week. It is looked at by a human judge to make sure that the plant material is identified correctly and that there isn't anything that would be too confusing for you to read in terms of your floral art education and journey. So give it a try. What have you got to lose, really? And in every sense, it makes you think about your designs and helps you with the next design that you're doing. So I will leave you to your next design, and I will get on with my next design. I'm Kim Bailey, and this is Floral Art Review.